So welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, July 10th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Pennsylvania and some recent news as a major Republican congressman, Dan Meuser, announces after Donald Trump has pushed for him to run for governor in Pennsylvania that he will not challenge Governor Josh Shapiro in the upcoming 2026 midterm elections. A pretty big deal coming after Donald Trump really wanted a prime mainstream candidate to run against Governor Shapiro in this upcoming midterm election. Largely, potentially at least, from what we have seen, to potentially stop Governor Shapiro from having a very strong victory like he did in the 2022 gubernatorial races. What we know is that across the GOP primary, there have been a number of candidates, major candidates who have considered running. When I say major, I don't mean good candidates. You have people like Doug Mastriano who said that he might run for governor should Stacey Garrity decide against running for governor. But now you have Dan Meuser, who is a U.S. representative, probably one of Donald Trump's biggest allies in the entire congressional delegation from the state of Pennsylvania, receiving the endorsement from the incumbent president, who will not run for governor, essentially paving the way for Stacey Garrity, the Pennsylvania state treasurer, to run against Governor Shapiro. Now, the big thing about Republicans and Pennsylvania is that in the governor's race in particular, they have had a very bad track record in this state. Only one time in the 21st century have they ever won the governorship in Pennsylvania, and that was in the 2010 midterm elections, to which 4 years later, in 2014, Democrats actually won back the governorship despite losing a number of other races across the country, and 2014 being one of the worst years on record for the Democratic Party in the 21st century. And yet, Tom Wolf, a Democratic challenger, defeated the Republican incumbent by nearly 10 points. And so thinking back last to when the Republicans were able to win in Pennsylvania, the national environment was fundamentally different than where it is today, and not at all similar to the 2026 midterms, and certainly not to the degree that it could be replicated again for a Republican victory. 2010 was an open race. The GOP had an opportunity. The voters in the state wanted it to happen. And also, Tom Corbett had been elected statewide before. Voters recognized his name. They knew his name. Dan Onorado had not been run statewide. He was a county executive. And so, a chief executive, not county executive. But thinking about what happened in 2010, it was a fluke. For all purposes, Pennsylvania had been a blue state in the gubernatorial level every single election, save this one in the 21st century, and that matters. And now looking at 2026, a lot of Republicans very much seem, at least, that they know that if they ran against Josh Shapiro, they would likely lose the gubernatorial race before it even began. His margin in 2022 was extremely impressive. And yes, part of it was that Doug Mastriano was a very lackluster candidate for the GOP by every single metric. He was so extreme that the National Republican Party refused to even give him a dime. He went all the way to Colorado at the convening of the Republican Governors Association to plead with them, to ask them to give him funding, to which they decided not to. The chair of the RGA had even said, when asked on CNN, "Are you going to fund Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania Senate race?" His response, "We fund races that we can win." The 2022 race was won largely because Doug Mastriano was a weak candidate, and largely because Josh Shapiro had been the most voted for Democrat in Pennsylvania state history. He outperformed Biden in 2020 and had a track record that showed that in this state, he was on the pathway to become governor. And become governor, he did. And he won in a state that in the 2020 election, Joe Biden won by 1.2%. He won in Pennsylvania by 15 percentage points. A state that Donald Trump won just a year ago, a state that Donald Trump won 9 years ago. This is where Republicans look at the previous election, and then they make their decisions accordingly. Because Donald Trump's potential endorsement, not potential, full-fledged endorsement, rather, of Dan Meuser, would have cleared the primary for him. Now, Stacey Garrity would have come off with slightly more name recognition, and that's because she's the Pennsylvania state treasurer. But thinking about it from that lens, thinking about Stacey Garrity, who's in this race, who had been reelected in 2024, flipped a race in 2020. That was on paper what might have been appealing to the White House or to Donald Trump. And Stacey Garrity is a very big proponent of President Trump. She went to a rally with him back in 22 with Dr. Oz, parroting the same talking points that the 2020 election was stolen. So she is an ally of Donald Trump, but Dan Meuser to a much higher degree. And so Donald Trump really wanted Meuser to win. Stacey Garrity did not come into this race with high name ID to a point that she was going to crush the primary. So what we knew was that if that endorsement had been publicized, Dan Meuser would have easily won this nomination. But the general election would have been very different. And so now there is this potential. Stacey Garrity very much floated with the idea that she was going to run for governor way early on. We expected that she was going to announce, but she wasn't necessarily going to be the front runner, right? I mean, that is something that you have to take into account, that yes, she had been elected statewide, but again, to the degree that which voters actually knew her, it was quite minimal. And it was going to be Donald Trump's full-fledged endorsement, if she got it, that could have put her over the finish line, but instead, it went to somebody else. But it is always so interesting. Donald Trump has been able to convince candidate after candidate to run in races, even in many races that they simply know they cannot win because he has the backing for him, for that candidate. If you think back to 2022 and you remember exactly what was able to put people like Doug Mastriano in the GOP spot for governor, for Senate, for House, very often and more often than not, it was Donald Trump's endorsement. And thinking about those 2022 midterm elections, I can't help but think about these endorsements that were able to give Democrats resounding victories in states they should not have even been able to approach for a chance after the 2020 election, given Biden's unpopularity at the point in time of the midterms. I think about people like Doug Mastriano, but even extending beyond Pennsylvania, I think about people like Tudor Dixon, who got Donald Trump's endorsement only to lose Michigan by 11 points. I think about Kari Lake, who took a race that was so winnable for the GOP that they had just won in the previous election in 2018 by 14 percentage points in 2022. Democrats flipped it, despite the national environment being significantly less favorable to Democrats, and yet Arizona voted more for the Democratic Party. The endorsements that Donald Trump put forward, Tim Michels in Wisconsin, to lose to Tony Evers by 3.4%, it was point after point after point. And so it is surprising that Dan Meuser, even with Donald Trump in his ear, can see the writing on the wall. That Josh Shapiro, more likely than not, is going to win re-election, and probably by a very substantial amount. So rather than lose his House seat, Meuser would rather not run, leave the opportunity open for at some point in the future, and allow Josh Shapiro to run a race against Stacey Garrity. A race that I believe, at its core, will be very strong for the Democratic Party. Cook Political Report, Larry Sabato's crystal ball, race to the White House, all saved this race as likely for the Democratic Party. Inside Elections has it as a battleground. I imagine that will not change. I imagine that will change sometime soon. And so, looking at the Pennsylvania governor's race, while Josh Shapiro has not formally announced that he is running for governor, there is a lot of expectation that he does. And looking at the running for re-election, with the Republican primary, it very much seems like Doug Mastriano will not run against Stacey Garrity, at least has said as much to the media, but, people change their minds all the time. But that she will likely be the Republican nominee, especially given that Donald Trump's chosen one has decided to back down. And so that is really what the crux of this argument is, that I'm not really interested in this GOP primary. At least not to the degree that I believe they are going to beat Josh Shapiro, because I do not believe Josh Shapiro loses this election. But very often, Donald Trump has led people to their demise, even in some cases like Georgia in 2022. Not talking about Herschel Walker. I'm not talking about, David Perdue, even in the governor's race. I'm talking about the coinciding state secretary race in Georgia that, believe it or not, looking back, we can actually pull this up here. What happened in the Georgia Republican primary in the Secretary of State's race, if you weren't tracking it, is honestly quite fascinating. Because although we all know the name Brad Raffensperger in the Secretary of State's office, this was not the first election that Brad Raffensperger faced that was contested in 2022. He faced a primary challenger from U.S. Representative Jody Hice in Georgia in the GOP primary in 2022, who cited that Brad Raffensperger was part of the steal, that he had helped Joe Biden take Georgia away from Donald Trump, yada, 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 all of these different things. And yet Brad Raffensperger came ahead. But it was at the direction of Donald Trump that Jody Hice decided to challenge Brad Raffensperger. He gave up a cushy seat in the House of Representatives to run for Secretary of State in a GOP primary and lost. And not by a small amount, lost by a lot. Donald Trump very often leads these Republicans astray, and yet they almost always will follow. But even in this case, the Pennsylvania governor's race does not even seem to be remotely possible for the GOP, and so they won't even consider it. That is what is fascinating. That is the point of this argument, that Pennsylvania, as a state that Donald Trump has won more often than not, is still not seen as a state that the GOP can win in the 2026 midterm elections. And so what I do think, too, is that similar to Mastriano, because of some of the positions that Stacey Garrity has taken in the past, she may lose the National Republican Party's full-fledged support in this race. Because like they said in 2022, they would prefer to fund races they know they could actually win. And if Pennsylvania starts off at baseline as a state, the Democrats are going to win by 5, 10, maybe 12 points in 2026. Is it worth even investing? The last time Pennsylvania was up in a midterm year favorable to Democrats was in 2018, when they beat Scott Wagner by 17 percentage points. Tom Wolf was the incumbent Democrat who won his election in the red wave year of 2014 by 10 points statewide. It was this margin with John Fetterman as the lieutenant governor, who is now the senator from Pennsylvania, the senior senator after Bob Casey lost re-election. But looking at this race in 2018, a very good race for Democrats, and a lot of it was contributed to the fact that this race was already going to be won by Democrats, and the Republicans knew that they couldn't really contest it. Taking a look at just the amount of influence in this race, too, if we actually take a look, let's see if they have the fundraising numbers or the amount of money that was spent in the race. The point is, the Democrats did outspend Republicans in this race, and it's largely because Republicans did not even contest this race at all. Right? You know, they knew that they were going to lose the governor's race. They knew they were going to lose the Senate race. And they knew that Pennsylvania, as a state that although Donald Trump had won in 2016, and as very much they would have liked to have won Pennsylvania again in 2018, it was simply not going to happen. Pennsylvania was going to vote blue in 2018, and there was nothing they could do about it, and it seems to be repeating itself in 2026. And so now thinking about the very obvious next segue, what does this governor's race not only mean for the GOP in 2028, but rather for a Josh Shapiro potential candidacy for president of the United States? Well, here's what I think. 2022 showing was impressive. It was a very substantial amount. It was 15 points in a state. The Democrats could not even crack more than 1.2% in the positive year that 2020 was for the National Democratic Party. So for Shapiro, for 2 years later, under a national environment that had shifted about 8 points towards the Republican Party from its last election, Josh Shapiro winning by nearly the same amount the Democrats did in a blue wave year is something that will be known and remembered for a very long time, especially if Josh Shapiro decides to run for president. But the next point is looking at this election and pending the margin in this race. If Pennsylvania ends up being a state that is decided by 10 points in 2026, after Donald Trump had just won this state by roughly 2 points, that really does elevate the electability argument for Shapiro. Because while some primary opponents, or even some members of the GOP, might write off 2022 as a fluke, as the best case scenario for Shapiro with the Dobbs decision and his electoral track record, and Doug Mastriano being uniquely weak, 2026 will put it into full force. Because if voters re-elect Shapiro, and you have crossover support, which you can track, between voters who voted for Trump and voters who voted for Shapiro, not just once in 22, but maybe again in 26, if that appeal maintains itself and becomes a mainstream part of Shapiro's politics, you could very well see somebody like him use this to become a notable candidate in 2028. And to say that he isn't already would really be an understatement, because a lot of people do see him as a potential contender in 2028. So largely speaking, I think that this 2026 gubernatorial race also has more to say about what people might perceive in the next presidential election. Because what I think Democrats want most right now is a party that is willing to fight for them and is able to win elections. Because that is the biggest problem with the National Democratic Party right now, is that they're not in the majority in the House. They're not in the majority in the Senate, and they sure as hell do not have the White House. And you have to get there to actually do things with the political power that you have. And so for Shapiro in 26, I think this will be a very big test for Shapiro and the Pennsylvania Democratic Party. And right now they're winning it. As the Republican Party backs down, and as a Trump-endorsed Republican, who's MAGA through and through, by the way, will say anything that comes out of the White House and will back Donald Trump to no end, you will find that even if he decides that with this backing of the president, I would easily have the nomination, that I know I can't beat Josh Shapiro, so I simply will not run, tells you everything you need to know about the current state of the race for the Pennsylvania GOP. So it'll be interesting. We can track, we can watch what happens in Pennsylvania over the next year and a half, but chances are we get an announcement from Stacey Garrity. She's faced up against Josh Shapiro and loses by maybe 10 points. More than that, all more impressive for Josh Shapiro. It'll be interesting because this race is starting off in a very strong position for the National Democratic Party, and chances are it's going to get even better over the coming weeks and months as this race starts to pan out, as Josh Shapiro announces a re-election, gets back into the groove of things, because right now, everybody is reading the writing on the wall. And it starts out very early on as at least a likely Democratic state. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.